It is the early morning hours of November 7th, the year 1811, near the small town of Prophetstown, modern battleground Indiana, and a middle-aged Native American man leads a large Native American force made up of Shawnee, Lenape, Miami, and many other nations in a morning ambush on an American army camp. This man, Tenskwatawa, also known as the Prophet, had earlier decided that facing the Americans in an all-out battle was foolish and decided to destroy the army with a morning raid on their camp. Little did he know that what was coming would prove to be an all-out battle. Tecumseh was born in 1768 in modern Ohio. His father, however, died in a border conflict in 1774 with the new United States. His brother, Lalawethika, was born in 1775. Tecumseh joined Blue Jacket and Little Turtle's Northwest Confederacy in the Northwest Indian War in the 1780s and 90s. Tecumseh and Lalawethika both took part in the decisive Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1792, which proved to be a defeat for the Native resistance. By 1796, Tecumseh was a leader among the Shawnee and had a son named Tecumseh. His band eventually settled along the White River near modern Anderson, Indiana for 8 years. During this time, Tecumseh and Lalawethika witnessed the sickness, poverty, alcoholism, and encroachment on native land and culture by the Americans. In 1805, Lalawethika began preaching a new religious movement, drawing on ideas of other prophets, such as the Delaware prophet Nealon, to reject American and European practices and ways of life, and to return to the more traditional native ways. The pair established a town near the ruins of Fort Greenville, at modern Greenville, Ohio. Lalawethika's message spread throughout the region, attracting many followers, even Blue Jacket, to their Greenville settlement. But Tecumseh was opposed by Blackhoof, a major leader among the Shawnee, prompting many Shawnee to reject Lalawethika's preachings. Tension with the government of Ohio, led from Chillicothe, prompted Tecumseh and the Prophet, as Lalawethika was called, to move west, north of present Lafayette, Indiana, establishing there a town called Prophetstown. It was here that Lalawethika changed his name to Tenskwatawa, meaning open door. With Prophetstown established, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa initially worked to peacefully coexist with the United States. However, in September of 1809, Governor of Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne, buying between 2.5 and 3 million acres of land in Indiana and Illinois. Many who lived on the land were excluded from the negotiations. This outraged Tecumseh, who went overnight from a minor to a major leader among the Shawnee. Tecumseh began to build an intertribal confederacy based on the Northwest Confederacy to oppose the U.S. In August of 1810, Tecumseh and Harrison met in Vincennes, the capital of Indiana Territory, in a legendary standoff. Tecumseh demanded that Harrison repeal the Fort Wayne Treaty and said he would resist American expansion into disputed territory. Tecumseh also said he would see to it that those who signed the treaty were punished, and he would be forming a confederacy to stop American expansion. Harrison stated the land was fairly bought, and Tecumseh had no right to reject. As the meeting ended, Harrison stated he would send Tecumseh's demands to President Madison, but he doubted he'd accept. Tecumseh stated that if Harrison did not repeal the Fort Wayne Treaty, you and I would have to fight it out. After his meeting with Harrison, Tecumseh went west, meeting with the Potawatomi, Winnebago, Sauk, Fox, Kickapoo, and Missouri Shawnee. Tecumseh then went to Fort Malden in Upper Canada to ask the British for assistance in the coming war, but the British refused to commit and urged Tecumseh to show restraint. By May of 1811, Tecumseh was in Ohio, attempting to recruit allies among the Shawnee, Wyandot, and Seneca. Tecumseh and Harrison met again in Vincennes in July of 1811, where Tecumseh told Harrison that he had established a confederacy of several northern nations and was going south to recruit more nations. From there, Tecumseh traveled south, meeting with several nations, including the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, Osage, Iowas, and Delaware. However, many in the South rejected Tecumseh's confederacy. Meanwhile, Harrison decided that Tecumseh's extended absence provided a great opportunity to stomp out native resistance in Indiana. Thus, Harrison marched on Prophetstown with about 1,000 soldiers. Harrison's forces reached the outskirts of Prophetstown on November 6th. There were plans to meet with Tenskwatawa the next day, but Harrison believed this meeting would go nowhere. On the night of November 6th, the native leaders of Prophetstown held a summit to decide how to deal with the Americans. The Winnebago wanted revenge against the Americans, who had killed 2 of their sentries earlier in the day, and reportedly, Tenskwatawa agreed to a preemptive strike on the American camp. In the early morning hours of November 7th, American soldiers woke up to scattered gunshots to find they had nearly been encircled by Tenskwatawa's forces. The American line faced attacks from all sides, while Tenskwatawa stood on an overlooking rock, chanting and singing to raise his soldiers' morale. After losing the element of surprise, however, the native line became disorganized and attacked in waves, retreating and reorganizing, then attacking again. The American dragoons attempted to charge the native line, but were repulsed, and the attack was worse in the rear line, where the Indiana Yellow Jacket force was situated, suffering heavy losses. Harrison sent 2 reserve companies to reinforce the Yellow Jackets. As the morning dragged on, the natives began running out of ammunition and retreated as the sun rose. Harrison's men pursued the natives, finding the bodies of 36 natives in the woods and scalping them. Harrison's force lost about 62 men, while the number of Native Americans killed is unknown. Upon returning to Prophetstown, Tenskwatawa's soldiers confronted him, accusing him of deceiving them because his magic should have prevented the number of casualties they sustained. Tenskwatawa blamed his wife for desecrating his magic and offered to cast a new spell, insisting that the Confederacy attack again, but the soldiers refused. On November 8th, Harrison's force entered Prophetstown to find it deserted, save an old woman too sick to flee. Harrison ordered the village burned, including the corn and bean stores. The American soldiers also dug up the burial ground, scattering the bodies throughout the ruins. Upon returning, the natives dug up and scattered the American dead in retaliation. Tecumseh was furious with Tenskwatawa and even threatened to kill him. After the Battle of Tippecanoe, Tenskwatawa played little role in the leadership of the Confederacy, but he continued to serve as a spiritual leader. Harrison thought the battle would stop native resistance, but a wave of native settler violence erupted following the battle. Tecumseh tried to restrain his soldiers from a preemptive attack and wanted to bide his time and build his strength. When the War of 1812 broke out, Tecumseh had around 800 warriors in Prophetstown and an estimated 3,500 warriors throughout the Midwest. With the breakout of the War of 1812 in July of, 1812, Tecumseh went to British Fort Malden to offer to join his cause with theirs. The British quickly recognized Tecumseh as among their most influential Native American allies. Tecumseh's forces, scouted as American General William Hull, entered Upper Canada and attempted to take Fort Malden. On July 25th, Tecumseh's force clashed with the Americans north of Amherstburg, Ontario, causing some of the first American casualties of the War of 1812. Tecumseh then turned his attention to cutting off the American supply line south of Detroit. Tecumseh then participated in the Battle of Maguaga on August 9th, stopping the Americans from attempting to invade Canada. On August 14th, British commander of Upper Canada, Major General Isaac Brock, arrived at Fort Malden and proposed a siege of Fort Detroit, where Hull was fortified, an idea to which Tecumseh remarked, "Now this is a man." Tecumseh led around 530 warriors in a siege on Fort Detroit. In one probably mythologized account, Tecumseh had his men pass through an opening in the woods that made it appear to be thousands of warriors attacking. Nevertheless, Hull surrendered on August 16th. Brock assured Tecumseh that the British would support native land claims, and Tecumseh's victory at Fort Detroit revived British discussions of a Native American buffer state in the Midwest. However, Brock was killed a few weeks later in the Niagara region, and a temporary armistice between Britain and the U.S. was signed, angering Tecumseh. In September of 1812, Tecumseh and fellow leader Roundhead went to assist in a siege of Fort Wayne in Indiana, but the siege failed before Tecumseh arrived. Another siege against Fort Harrison in Terre Haute also failed. Tecumseh then returned to Prophetstown for the winter of 1812. Tecumseh returned to Amherstburg in April of 1813. The Americans had suffered a defeat against the British in Wyandotte at the Battle of Frenchtown in January, but were pushing back toward Fort Detroit under the command of William Henry Harrison. Tecumseh and Roundhead led about 1,200 warriors to Fort Meigs near modern Perrysburg, Ohio, along the Maumee River. The natives initially saw little action, while British forces under General Henry Proctor laid siege to the fort. On May 5th, however, an American relief force arrived. Thus, Tecumseh led an attack from the fort, then crossed the Maumee River to help attack a regiment of Kentucky militiamen. While inflicting heavy casualties, the British and natives were unable to take the fort. One of the most famous events of Tecumseh's life occurred after this battle. A large group of American POWs were brought to the ruins of Fort Miami by the natives, who began killing the Americans. This prompted Tecumseh to rush to intervene and spare the lives of the American prisoners. Tecumseh and Proctor returned to Fort Meigs in July of 1813. Tecumseh led a force of 2,501 soldiers, the largest force he would ever lead. Tecumseh hoped to goad the Americans into an open battle and staged a mock battle to draw the Americans out of the fort, but the trick failed, and so did the second siege. Following the Battle of Lake Erie, which was an American victory, Proctor decided to retreat to Amherstburg. Tecumseh attempted to convince Proctor to stay and fight, stating, "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is His will, we wish to leave our bones upon them." Proctor decided that even a defense of Amherstburg was untenable, with the Americans in control of Lake Erie, and decided to fall back to Chatham. Tecumseh reluctantly agreed. The British burned Fort Malden and the public buildings in Amherstburg and retreated, pursued by William Henry Harrison. When Tecumseh arrived at Chatham, he realized Proctor had sent a message that he decided to make a stand near Moraviantown, Ontario. Tecumseh was angered by this, but decided to stage an attack on the Americans to slow their advance. In this attack, he was wounded in the arm. Tecumseh reunited with Proctor, and the pair faced off against Harrison in the Battle of the Thames. Proctor was on the left flank with his British regulars, and Tecumseh was on the right in the wood line, hoping to flank the Americans. When fighting broke out, the British line almost immediately collapsed and fled, leaving Tecumseh to face the Americans alone. Harrison ordered a charge into the native line, and in the intense fighting, Tecumseh was killed. After the battle, the Americans stripped and scalped Tecumseh's body, and some even took pieces of his skin as souvenirs. Tecumseh's death led to the collapse of his Confederacy. By the 1830s, most Shawnee still in Ohio were forced to relocate west due to the Indian Removal Act. William Henry Harrison rode his victory against Tecumseh to the White House, becoming America's 9th president in 1841 and giving the longest inauguration speech in history on a cold, rainy day. He died of pneumonia almost a month later. Thanks for watching.